I was 13 when it started entering my room at night and sitting on my bed like it owned the place. I am 18 now, and I still sleep in the same room because my parents never believed there was anything to escape from. This was not a nightmare that faded with daylight, and it is not a story I invented for attention. It was something that pressed into my mattress and left marks on my body. My room is small with a bed under the window and a narrow door facing the hallway where my parents' room is only a few steps away. The walls are thin enough to hear footsteps and the television downstairs, so I always know when everyone is asleep. Nothing strange happens during the day, and nothing ever moves while someone else is in the room with me. It only comes when I am alone and the house is completely still. The first nights began with silence that felt controlled, as if every normal sound had been switched off at once. I would wake up suddenly, fully aware, staring at the ceiling while my chest tightened without warning. My body would stiffen before I even saw it, like it knew something had entered the room. That reaction became predictable, and that predictability made it worse. I was not a little kid imagining monsters, and I was old enough to understand that what I was seeing did not belong inside a normal house. That is what made it terrifying, because I had no excuse to hide behind. I knew it was there. Before it would show itself clearly, the mattress would dip near my legs as if someone had carefully placed weight on the edge of the bed. I would try to move my foot to confirm I was awake, but nothing below my neck would respond. My breathing would speed up, and I could feel my heart pounding hard enough to shake my ribs. That was when I understood I was not alone. It sat on my bed with long, thin limbs folded under its body and a head slightly too large for its frame. Its skin looked dry and tight, and its eyes stayed wide open without blinking. It leaned forward slowly and pressed two dark nails into my stomach through my shirt. The pressure went deeper than skin, even though nothing broke. I could not lift my arms, and I could not turn away while it studied my face like I was an object. Its mouth would open slightly, and I could see dark residue between its teeth as it moved closer. It never spoke, and it never rushed. It acted patient. In the morning, I had round swollen marks around my abdomen that hurt when I pressed down. My parents told me I must have scratched myself, and my brother Miles laughed and said I was stressed from school. They checked my room and found nothing. The next night, it came back. Before the worst visits, I would wake up seconds before it appeared, already tense and unable to relax even for a moment. I would lie there staring at the ceiling, waiting for the mattress to sink again because I knew it would. The silence would settle over the house like a switch had been flipped. My body would lock completely before I even saw it move. It began climbing onto my torso instead of sitting at the edge of the bed, placing its knees against my ribs and its palms flat against my stomach. It pressed harder each time, slow and steady, as if testing how much force I could handle. I felt pressure deep under my skin that made my vision blur. I tried to scream, but only air moved in my throat. One night, it pushed so hard that my back arched off the mattress, and I felt something inside my abdomen shift under its palm. Its face lowered until it was inches from mine, and its eyes scanned me without blinking. I forced my arms to lift, and they trembled uselessly before dropping again. I had no control over my own body. My parents installed a camera in my room and stayed awake outside my door for several nights. During those nights, nothing happened, and the footage showed me sleeping normally. They removed the camera after deciding this was stress or sleep paralysis. The next night, it returned and pressed deeper than ever. The night everything changed, I fell asleep in the back of my parents' car while my father was driving us home from my aunt's house. I remember the streetlights passing by and trying to stay awake because I did not trust sleep anymore. My body ignored me and shut down. When I opened my eyes, I was in my own bed with my shoes still on. There was no sound of a door opening or footsteps in the hallway. The nightlight was on and my room looked untouched. My heart began racing immediately because I knew what silence like that meant. I tried to sit up quickly, but my legs stopped halfway and froze in place. The mattress dropped behind me before I could turn around fully. It was closer than ever, its fingers already gripping my shoulders firmly. It slid one hand under my shirt and pressed hard against my stomach, and the pulling sensation returned stronger than before. I felt like something inside me was being drawn toward its palm. It leaned forward until our foreheads touched, and I could see cracks on its lips and dryness around its eyes. I tried to push it away again, but my arms would not respond. I was completely trapped inside my own body while it examined me up close. The pressure increased steadily, and I felt pain spreading through my abdomen in waves that made it hard to breathe. Its fingers dug in without breaking skin, and my back lifted off the mattress under the force. I could not close my eyes or turn my head. I could only stare at it. It held its palm flat against my stomach and stayed there, unmoving, as if waiting for something to happen under my skin. The pulling sensation intensified, and I felt panic building fast because I did not know what it was taking from me. My chest tightened, and I thought I might pass out. The door suddenly opened, and Miles stepped into the room asking what I was doing awake. The weight vanished instantly, and I collapsed forward onto the bed, gasping for air. My brother looked around confused because there was nothing there. I started crying without control while he stood in the doorway. That was the closest it ever got to doing something worse than leaving marks. After that night, the visits became less frequent, but they did not stop completely. When I was 17, it appeared again after months of absence, standing beside my bed instead of climbing onto it immediately. My body locked as usual, and I felt the familiar wave of fear rising in my chest. It reached out and placed its hand lightly against my stomach. This time, it did not press deeply. It held its palm there for several seconds as if checking something, then slowly withdrew. Its head tilted slightly while it studied my face. I did not move because I could not. It stepped back from the bed and disappeared without sound or warning. I remained frozen for several minutes after it was gone. That was the last intense encounter I remember clearly. I am 18 now, and it still comes sometimes, though far less often than when I was 13. I wake up seconds before it arrives, and my body still locks without any permission. Sometimes I find faint circular marks on my lower abdomen in the morning. My parents pretended nothing ever happened, and Miles moved out last year, so I face the nights alone again. When it stands near my bed now, it does not always touch me, but I never know when that will change. I do not feel stronger with age. I live waiting for the next visit, knowing I will not be able to move when it happens. I do not know what it wants or how long it plans to keep coming back. I only know that it has never fully left. This story is based on the creepypasta of The Seed Eater, an online horror tale about a thin humanoid entity that visits children at night while they are awake but unable to move. The creature sits on the bed and presses its hands into the child's abdomen, leaving circular marks by morning without breaking the skin. Adults never see it, even when they monitor the room, which deepens the sense of isolation. As the child grows older, the visits become less frequent, but the entity never fully disappears. My name is Mara Vance, and I worked as a police officer in Virginia for 18 years before I quit. This happened decades ago, but the details have not faded with time. I can still hear the faint drag of costume fabric brushing against my cabinets, and I can still hear the sound my daughter made when she realized I was not fast enough to protect her. People in my town used to whisper about something called the Bunny Man, an old local story about a man in a rabbit suit from the 1970s who threatened people near wooded roads, but those stories always felt distant and exaggerated. I believed in evidence, not folklore. When parents started filing reports about a tall man in a worn rabbit costume standing near playgrounds during Easter week, most of the department treated it like a prank. But I watched the security footage myself and noticed that he simply stood there, watching children with a stillness that felt deliberate and patient. This was not a joke. That was surveillance. At the time, I was a single mother with a 4-year-old daughter named Lila. I balanced night shifts with bedtime stories and plastic eggs scattered across our living room. I believed I could manage both worlds because I carried a badge, a gun, and years of training. I believed experience meant control. I was wrong. The first child disappeared 2 days before Easter. His parents had seen a rabbit-costumed man near the swings minutes before he vanished. We searched the park, nearby houses, and every registered offender in the area. There was no forced entry, no vehicle description, and no face. Only a costume described as dirty white with long ears hanging sideways and dark stains across the chest. Within 48 hours, 2 more children went missing from different neighborhoods. In both cases, someone mentioned seeing the same tall figure at a distance. He appeared close to children who later disappeared, then vanished himself. The media connected it to the old Virginia legend, which only fueled panic. Our briefings grew heavier by the hour. 3 missing children in 2 days meant something organized, something planned. We mapped patterns, tracked Easter events, and increased patrols. Yet we were reacting to someone who moved slowly and carefully. There was no clear suspect. Only that costume. At home, I double-checked every lock before bed. I kept my service weapon on the nightstand and told myself that vigilance was enough. I reassured Lila with calm words I did not fully believe. I convinced myself that monsters stayed outside. Lila fell asleep quickly after too much sugar and excitement. I stayed awake reviewing case notes at the kitchen table, unable to quiet my thoughts. When the clock passed 2 in the morning, I forced myself to bed. Around 3, Lila shook my shoulder and whispered that the Easter bunny was in the kitchen, eating her candy. I told her to go back to sleep. I did not check the hallway. I did not open my eyes fully. That decision has played in my mind more times than I can count. Minutes later, a heavy thump echoed through the house, followed by a scream that snapped me upright before I was fully awake. It was raw panic. I reached for my gun and felt nothing but bare wood beneath my hand. I ran barefoot down the hallway into the kitchen. The overhead light was on. The back door stood open. On the tile floor, a tall figure in a stained rabbit suit knelt beside a large canvas sack. Lila's legs were visible as he forced her inside. Her hands pushed against the rough fabric while she screamed for me. I charged him without thinking. He turned slowly, as if expecting me. His eyes were visible through the mesh. He swung his arm, and something heavy struck the side of my head. Adrenaline kept me upright as I grabbed the fabric of his costume and tried to pull him away from the sack. The material felt cheap and thin beneath my fingers. He drove his elbow into my jaw and sent me stumbling into the counter. I tasted blood and heard Lila struggling inside the bag. He adjusted the rabbit mask with one hand as if it annoyed him, then rushed forward with sudden force. His shoulder slammed into my chest and knocked me onto the tile. My head struck the floor hard enough to blur my vision. I kicked at his knees and managed to shift his balance for a second. It was enough time to grab the rope at the top of the sack and pull. Lila's sobs came through the canvas as I tried to untie it. He seized my hair from behind and dragged me across the kitchen floor. My nails scraped uselessly against the tile. He rolled me onto my back and pressed his forearm against my throat, pinning me down with steady pressure. Through the small opening in the mask, I heard him speak in a low, controlled voice. "You should have locked the door better. You should have watched her." I tried to reach anything within range, but my weapon was gone. He struck my temple again, and the kitchen vanished into darkness. The last thing I saw was him lifting the sack over his shoulder, while Lila's cries faded through the open door. When I regained consciousness, the kitchen light was still burning, and the back door moved slightly in the wind. Blood had dried along my face, but I forced myself outside. Tire tracks cut through the dirt near the fence. I called dispatch and reported the kidnapping with a voice that sounded unfamiliar. Within minutes, patrol cars flooded the street. I explained what happened and refused to remain behind. Evidence teams collected fibers and partial boot prints. We followed the tire marks until they merged with traffic and nearly disappeared. Instead of stopping there, I drove the nearby back roads where mud preserved clearer impressions. Eventually, I spotted a distinct tread pattern leading toward an abandoned service road. Backup followed as I approached an old farmhouse with boarded windows and overgrown weeds. We positioned around the house in tense silence. No sounds came from inside. That silence pressed against my ears harder than any scream. On my signal, we forced entry and cleared each room methodically. The ground floor was empty except for trash and dust, but fresh footprints led toward the basement door. We descended the narrow stairs with weapons raised. Before reaching the bottom, I heard it. Soft crying. Not one voice, but several, restrained and terrified. The basement was lit by a single hanging bulb. Along the walls, children were tied with rope. Some were blindfolded. Some were too exhausted to react. We cut them free and called for medical units. I counted faces, matching them to reports filed days earlier. Lila was not among them. There were signs he had stayed there temporarily, including food wrappers and water bottles. A rear basement door stood open to the woods, and fresh tracks showed he had fled minutes before we arrived. We searched the forest with dogs and helicopters until dawn, but the trail vanished near a highway. He was gone. So was my daughter. We never found him. I never found Lila. The case remains open, though most of the officers who worked it have retired. The rescued children described a man in a rabbit suit who spoke calmly and told them they were part of something special. None of them saw his real face. I left the force 2 years later. The image of that mask has not faded, and neither has the sound of my daughter calling my name from inside that sack. People still treat the bunny man like a legend, but I know better. I can still remember the tenderness of my little brother's skin as I bit down on his arm during a fight we had when I was 12. The softness of his flesh against my teeth and the metallic taste of his blood on my tongue were euphoric, and it was that moment that changed my life forever. The psychologists call it Wendigo psychosis, but the actual term was pathological cannibalism. I can never forget the horrid look on my mother's face as Brenda, my childhood psychologist, told her that I was going to struggle with pathological cannibalism, an extremely rare but real issue that sometimes occurs due to underlying psychiatric disorders or problems. Even though I was so young, I could tell everyone around me thought I was a monster. What made things even worse was that none of the many psychologists my mother dragged me to knew how to handle my issue, because cases involving pathological cannibalistic impulses were extraordinarily rare, and there was little to no knowledge about my condition. My mother often told me that I wasn't always like this, but she could see the signs, as my strange behavior all started when I was 7. During that age, I started showing signs of extreme alatriophagy, a disorder where a person repeatedly eats or consumes things that aren't normally considered food. I would consume everything from my hair to my fingernails, and I would struggle with my mother when she quickly took these things out of my mouth before I could swallow. I would even throw tantrums whenever she tried to stop me. Things only got worse from there, as when I was 10, I developed another condition called dermatophagia, a condition where a person compulsively bites their own skin, drawing blood. I would leave deep marks on my arms, hands, and fingers, and there were cases where my mother had to rush me to the hospital to stop the bleeding. After an examination, the psychologist told my parents that I'd developed a disturbing body-focused repetitive behavior. They made several attempts to fix my peculiar case of BFRB with self-biting behavior as they tried everything they could to stop me from doing it. In the end, all their efforts failed, and it wasn't long before my disorders eventually turned into full-blown autophagia, which is the morbid act of consuming one's own flesh. The new condition was basically an extreme form of dermatophagia, as rather than simply biting down on my skin to draw blood, I began to tear out and eat my own flesh. A little while after I turned 12, my mother found me bleeding on the floor with a huge patch of flesh missing from my leg. I had disassociated due to my psychiatric illness and cut off parts of my own skin using a sharp knife. I can still remember the disgust on my mother's face as she found me sitting there with a mouthful of my own flesh. Later that same month, my older brother Kevin tried to stop me from hurting myself again so I wouldn't eat my flesh or bite myself, and I didn't let him. So we got into a huge fight and I bit him. It was at that moment that I got a sick epiphany, as I realized that it would be much better to eat other people to satiate this never-ending hunger for flesh. It was a sick revelation, but even at that young age, I knew that it was much better than eating my own flesh. It was at this point that my childhood psychologist, Brenda, diagnosed me with pathological cannibalism that I talked about earlier. She told my parents that all the disorders I developed throughout my early childhood were leading up to this, and she assured my parents that she'd help me overcome the pathology, which she often referred to as Wendigo psychosis. But even after hours of examinations and therapy sessions, she or any of the following psychologists weren't able to help me. It's hard to put the feelings into words, but I've always felt like there was something sinister living inside of me. A monster that was always whispering in my ear and urging me to sink my teeth into my own flesh just so I could taste my skin and the metallic flavor of the blood that flowed. I always tried my best to fight back, but these feelings were overwhelming, even when I was a child. However, after I viciously bit my brother's arm, the voice changed the words it used to whisper, as it was now telling me to eat and consume everyone around me. I often suffered identity shifts and memory gaps, during which I would commit even more atrocious cannibalistic acts. When I was much older, my psychologist told me that the core motor cluster of psychiatric disorders I'd been suffering from due to my neurological abnormalities had gotten a lot worse with age. They said my cannibalistic urges had become paraphilic, which could unfortunately lead to even more frequent psychosis-driven behavioral escalation, and they urged me to take some medication to subdue my severe paraphilic disorders. I was given several high-dose antipsychotics like olanzapine, risperidone, and haloperidol to treat the underlying psychosis. I was then told that these drugs would help fix and subdue most of the paraphilic disorders and psychiatric illnesses. But no matter how many pills I took, my compulsive urges never fully went away. I secretly lived with these urges, carrying them around like they were a badge of shame. I eventually fell into a deep depression and reached a new low point in my life. But it was around this time that my mother had a long, deep talk with me about my issues, and she told me that I was stronger than my disorders, so I shouldn't let the urges control my life. From that moment on, I made a conscious decision to change my life. I went to college for 4 years and got a good-paying job. I even started dating, and I eventually married my beautiful wife, Claire, who gave birth to a son we named Philip. It took me several years of struggle to get my life to that point, and even though I felt like I'd achieved what I set out to do, the voice of that monster was still there. I eventually stopped taking my antipsychotics out of anger because I assumed they weren't working anymore, as I could occasionally hear the voice telling me to rip apart the flesh of my wife, Claire, while she was asleep. I felt like I didn't need them anymore, as I told myself that the love for my family would help me overcome my urges. But I was wrong, as the voices just got louder. I knew it was only a matter of time before my disorders got out of hand again, and I didn't want to dissociate and hurt my family, as I knew I would never forgive myself. So I desperately looked for an outlet, and it wasn't long before I came across the infamous Cannibals Cafe forum on the dark web. I heard about it before, but I didn't think it was real. I'd also seen some people online saying that the original site, which used to be on the internet during the late 90s, had been taken down, so I thought there was no other way to access it. However, one night when the voices had become unbearable as they were constantly urging me to carry out sadistic acts, I downloaded the Tor browser to access the dark web, and I eventually came across a dark web forum called Cannibals Cafe. I was confused, as I knew the original Cannibal Cafe website on the ClearNet had been shut down around 2002. However, I later found out from members of the exclusive forum that even though both forums shared the same name, this particular dark web forum was inspired by and modeled after the original Cannibal Cafe. This dark web forum felt like my salvation, as it allowed me to talk about things my psychologist didn't understand with other like-minded cannibals on the forum. I logged on and talked to other members of the forum every night after my wife had gone to bed. There was a small part of me that knew what I was doing was wrong, but every minute I spent on that forum made me feel like I had finally found a place where I belonged. It really seemed like I was a recovering alcoholic who had just walked into a wine tasting event. But in this case, the alcoholism was cannibalism, and the wine tasters were connoisseurs of human flesh who constantly validated my desires by telling me I wasn't wrong for feeling this way. all of the anonymous people on the Cannibals Cafe forum became an avenue for me to vent and channel my urges. The voices grew much louder now, but I was fine with it because I came across an anonymous individual whose username was Maywest Disciple 783, and he told me that I should embrace the monster I believed was inside of me. I met Maywest Disciple 783 about a month after I started visiting the Cannibals Cafe forum, and we grew very close. We were both huge fans of the Rotenberg cannibal, a German man named Armin Maywest who consumed parts of another man named Bernd Brandes. Maywest was a cannibal like us, and in the year 2001, he posted an ad on the internet looking for a willing participant who would allow him to consume their body and fulfill his cannibalistic desires. Bernd Brandes saw the ad and agreed to do it. After meeting Maywest, both men severed Bernd's genitalia and ate it. Unfortunately, Bernd later died, but Armin Maywest did not let his corpse go to waste, as he consumed parts of the body before he was unjustly thrown in prison. Maywest Disciple 783 and I had a lengthy conversation about how unjust the incarceration of Armin Maywest was, and we even spoke about pooling some money together so we could buy the alleged tape of Maywest eating Bernd's corpse that's somewhere out there on the dark web. After we bonded over our shared love for Armin Maywest, I began to text Maywest Disciple 783 for hours on end. We eventually made our own private dark web forum called Cannibals Anonymous, where we would talk about our desires, and he told me that I shouldn't try to silence the voice in my head with the high-dose antipsychotics that psychologists had told me to start taking again. He told me to accept the words the little voice in my head kept whispering, because there was nothing wrong with eating one another if it was consensual. The more we talked, the more I believed that the anonymous man behind Maywest Disciple 783 was the only person in the world who truly understood me. We spent most of our free time texting back and forth during the months that followed, and one Saturday, Maywest Disciple 783 sent me a message that would once again alter the course of my life moving forward. He suggested that we both fulfill our desires like Maywest and Brandes, and that we should set a date and a location where we could consensually eat parts of each other's flesh. I was ecstatic because I'd never had a willing individual offer me parts of their flesh to consume, and I remember telling myself that there was nothing wrong with it, as it was all consensual. After texting back and forth on our private dark web forum for some time, I quickly took out a huge chunk of my wife's and my savings to buy a remote cabin we could use to carry out our plans. I even lied to my wife, telling her that I had a business trip that weekend and I was counting the days until it happened. However, when the weekend came, I got an unfortunate text from Maywest Disciple 783, telling me that he had second thoughts and that he wanted to back out. Words can't explain the rage I felt at that moment, and I became even more infuriated when I tried to convince him, and he stopped answering my texts. I'd stopped going to my psychologist at this point, and I'd thrown away all the antipsychotics I'd been taking, so my mind couldn't handle the rejection. I remember letting out a guttural scream, and suddenly everything around me went dark. When I came back to my senses, I watched in horror as my wife Claire was cowering in front of me while holding our 2-year-old son Philip, who now had bleeding wounds all over his body and was screaming at the top of his lungs. I didn't need anyone to tell me the atrocities I'd just committed, as I could see nasty bite marks all over my son's body, and I could still taste the metallic flavor of his blood on my tongue. I couldn't believe I tried to eat and consume my very own son, and I collapsed screaming because I remembered that horrified look on people's faces when I used to dissociate as a kid. No one had looked at me that way since my mother found me eating my flesh when I was 12, but it was the same expression my wife had on her face as she put enough distance between our son and me. I will never be able to express the magnitude of guilt I felt in the hours that followed. My wife Claire, who was still looking at me like I was a monster, had to fight me off and stop me from eating our own son. I knew that was the end of our family, but Claire loved me too much to call the police, and even if she hated me in that moment, she still knew I was the man who loved her for all those years, and she didn't want her son's father to spend the rest of his life in prison. So she decided to check me into a mental institution, saying I was a danger to myself and others. I didn't protest, as I knew I deserved much worse for what I'd done. It's been about 3 years now in this institution. My wife has stopped coming to see me, and I don't even blame her. I don't even know what day it is, but I am currently sitting in my room writing this disturbing table of what was once my life in a journal to pass the time. I often wonder if death would finally satiate the seemingly insatiable morbid hunger of the monster that still lives inside of me. It's taken me some time, but I've come to the realization that it's only when I leave this world that the voice nagging me in my head will stop. And I truly hope that when that day comes, I will finally understand what it means to have some peace and quiet. In the year 2004, a truly morbid true crime case that is mostly unknown to the public occurred in the small town of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. It was an extremely niche case, and most of the details were redacted. But according to a few statements from locals, it was later revealed that an anonymous man was institutionalized at the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center after he had attempted to attack his family. Official reports were sparse, as the case was never reported to local authorities. However, a few anonymous neighbors who gave second-hand accounts claimed that the institutionalized man had attempted to cannibalize and eat his own infant son the night before. His wife, whose name was also redacted, chose to give no official statements. Locals believed that she wanted to protect her husband, whose attempted filicide would have landed him at least 20 years in prison on an attempted murder charge, so she denied everything. The widely unknown case was seen as a rumor during the weeks that followed the initial reports, but records show that the disturbing details of the case actually happened, as the anonymous man apparently suffered from a psychotic and dissociative episode, which led his wife to admit him to the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center. While it was never confirmed, sources close to the unnamed family said that even though he'd committed an atrocious act that nearly killed their son, she still didn't want the father of her child to spend the rest of his life in prison. It is unclear what happened after the anonymous man was checked into the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center. Several records show that the center was closed in 2007, and both his and his family's current whereabouts are unknown. I also found it difficult to trace the exclusive dark web Cannibal Cafe forum that the Anam referenced in 2004. Several records confirm that the original Cannibal Cafe never existed on the dark web, as it was strictly a ClearNet website created in 1994 by an individual using the alias Pero Loco. While I was able to confirm the exact origins of the dark web forum mentioned in this case, it is believed to have been one of the several successor sites that emerged after the original Cannibal Cafe was shut down in 2002. The gruesome case of attempted cannibalism sparked similar discourse to the more famous Armin Mae West case during the months that followed the incident. There were apparently a few people who argued whether an individual should be jailed or placed in an asylum for carrying out a consensual act, even if the act was something as morbid as cannibalism. However, regardless of differing opinions, the law remains crystal clear. Several law enforcement agents who weighed in with their opinions on the case stated that it doesn't matter whether both parties consent to ghoulish acts like cannibalism or murder, because at the end of the day, these acts are illegal, and any individual carrying them out will be punished by the full force of the law. It all happened on a night like any other. I was home alone with my computer and I wanted to access the dark web. I had done it before with friends and I was always curious to go further. I wasn't trying to buy anything or do anything crazy. I was just curious, and the whole challenge made me feel like I was doing something important, even though I knew it was mostly boredom. When the last setting finally clicked and the browser opened a hidden page, I felt a quick rush. Not strong, but enough to keep me there. The first sites looked outdated and almost harmless. I scrolled through them without much interest because everything looked like bad forms or broken links. For a moment, I wondered why people made such a big deal out of all of this, because what I was seeing felt cheap and pointless. I clicked through a list of black market pages that didn't surprise me at all, since most seemed empty or full of junk I didn't care about. My curiosity started fading. I wanted something shocking, but not too shocking. Something that felt like a secret without being dangerous. Before closing everything, I decided to try something stupid. I searched for the name of a guy from school and got nothing. Then I searched for a neighbor and again got nothing. I almost closed the browser. That's when the screen changed from boring junk to something that made me lean forward without even noticing. A long list of folders appeared, each with a strange title made of different letters and numbers. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The dates on the right side went back 10 years. The exact year we moved across the country without much explanation. Seeing that timing made my chest tighten. Not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, steady way that made me nervous. I clicked one folder and saw a list of video files. I clicked another folder and it was the same thing. Every folder was full of videos with the same kind of names, like someone followed a pattern. I sat there staring because it didn't make any sense that searching for my parents would lead to this. I started wondering if someone had used their names for something illegal or if someone had tried to follow them. Before opening a video, I hesitated. I didn't want to see something awful, but I needed to know if this involved them or just someone else with the same names. After a long moment of convincing myself I was overthinking, I clicked a random file. The video showed the outside of my old house. My parents stepped out of the car like any normal evening, except a young man walked behind them, very close, keeping his head down. Neither of my parents looked at him. The sight made my stomach twist. I clicked another video because I needed answers. And this time, the screen showed a basement. A young man was tied to a chair, shaking and gagging, struggling to breathe. I recognized the basement right away. It was ours. I kept staring at the screen because I expected the video to glitch or cut or reveal a prank, but it didn't. The boy cried through the gag, and his legs jumped with every breath. That was when fear started getting real. Not panic, but a feeling that I no longer understood who my parents were. I clicked the next video even though every part of me wanted to stop. I needed clarity, even if the answers scared me. Before the video loaded, I felt a tightness in my throat because I could tell something heavier was coming. I waited without moving, and when the next image appeared, I felt a cold rush spread down my arms. The camera pointed at my parents walking into the basement wearing pig masks. Their steps were slow and steady. And the boy jerked in the chair when he saw them approach. My father rolled a table of tools next to him while my mother adjusted the ropes with a calmness that didn't match the situation. The next video showed my father hitting the boy repeatedly with controlled movements like he had practiced this before. The boy's body shook each time, and the sound was so clear that I moved back from the laptop. The next file showed my mother holding a hammer. She pressed nails into the boy's arms and forced them in one at a time while he tried to scream through the gag, and his whole body twisted in pain. A wave of nausea hit me so hard that I had to cover my mouth. The next video showed the boy vomiting from the pain and choking because he couldn't spit anything out. His head was jerking forward, and tears ran down his face as he tried to breathe through blocked air. The next file showed my parents removing sections of skin from the boy's cheek. Their hands didn't shake. Their breathing was steady. They were focused. I scrolled through the files quickly, desperate to stop seeing more, but unable to stop looking. Every scroll revealed more videos, more dates, more proof that this wasn't edited. It had happened in that basement, in the house where I slept as a kid without knowing anything was going on below me. I opened another video and the screen stayed black for a moment. I stared at it, knowing something worse was about to begin, because silence in those recordings always meant a new step. When the video finally started, I heard a loud motor, heavy and fast, echoing through the basement. A chainsaw. The moment the sound hit, I snapped the laptop shut so fast I felt the impact through my fingers. My body pushed back against the wall because I didn't want to hear anything else. I didn't even want to breathe. I forced myself to open the laptop again because I needed to close everything. But when the page refreshed, something new appeared. A new folder with my name on it. I couldn't process it. I stared at my own name like it didn't belong to me. I didn't touch anything. I didn't blink. My hands were shaking so hard that the laptop screen blurred for a second. I didn't know if the folder had been created just now or if it had always been there and I hadn't noticed. But the idea that someone had added it while I was watching the videos made my chest hurt. Before I could react, I heard a car door outside. I froze completely because my parents weren't supposed to be home yet. Another car door closed and footsteps moved across the driveway. My heartbeat got so loud it felt like it was hitting the inside of my skull, and I backed away from the laptop as if distance would help. The footsteps reached the front door. Keys rattled. The lock turned, I looked around the room and realized I had nowhere to go. The windows were too high. The hallways were narrow. I was trapped with the memory of what I had just seen and the fear that they already knew I had found it. The door opened downstairs. Their voices were calm, talking about groceries or something normal, and that normal tone only made the situation worse. Their footsteps moved toward the stairs. I grabbed the laptop and shut the lid so hard the hinge cracked. Then I sat on the floor because my legs felt unsteady. I held the laptop against my chest like a shield, even though it couldn't protect me from anything. Their steps came up slowly. My door opened without knocking, and my mother stood there with a relaxed smile like she had no idea what was happening inside my mind. Nothing matched what I had seen in the videos. It felt like two versions of them existed at the same time. My mother stayed near the door and spoke with a cheerful voice. "We brought something special for you." And she smiled with a look I had never seen before. I wondered what was happening, if any of this was real, until...
I followed her on TikTok long before I ever met her in person. Everyone did. She had hundreds of thousands of followers, posted makeup tutorials and fashion hauls and day-in-the-life videos that made her seem glamorous and untouchable, like someone who lived in a completely different world than the rest of us. Her name was Maya, and she built her entire online persona around being perfect, the kind of influencer who never showed cracks, never admitted mistakes, always maintained the image of someone whose life was enviable in every possible way. I thought I knew her from watching her content. I had no idea how wrong I was until the night she tried to kill me. It started with her mother. I had been seeing Maya's mother's boyfriend for a few months, a casual relationship that nobody took too seriously except apparently Maya's mom. When he ended things with her to focus on his career, she did not take it well. She started calling him obsessively, showing up at his apartment uninvited, making threats about what she would do if he did not come back to her. He told me about it, but downplayed the severity, said she was just upset and would calm down eventually. Neither of us realized she was involving Maya, turning her daughter into an accomplice in whatever plan was forming in her mind. The first contact came through Instagram. Maya sent me a direct message, friendly and casual, saying she had heard I knew her mom's ex and wanted to talk about the situation. Maybe clear the air and help everyone move on peacefully. Her profile looked legitimate. Millions of followers and verified checkmark and that same polished image she projected in all her videos. I thought having a conversation with her might actually help de-escalate things, so I agreed to meet. She suggested a location outside the city, said it would be more private and comfortable than meeting at a coffee shop where people might recognize her. That should have been my first warning, but I was naive enough to believe a TikTok influencer with a wholesome online image could not possibly be dangerous. I drove out to meet her on a Friday night in February, following the directions she sent to a quiet stretch of road lined with trees and minimal streetlights. She said she would be there with a friend, that it would just be a quick conversation to sort everything out. When I pulled into the meeting spot, I saw two cars waiting, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Maya was standing outside one of them, dressed casually in the kind of outfit she would never post online, no makeup, no ring light, just a young woman who looked nervous and tense. Her mother was in the other car, and that is when my stomach started to drop, when I realized this was not going to be the peaceful conversation I had been promised. What happened next unfolded so fast I barely had time to process it. Maya's mother got out of her car screaming, calling me names and accusing me of ruining her relationship, her voice echoing across the empty road. I tried to calm her down, tried to explain that I had nothing to do with her boyfriend's decision, but she was beyond reason. Maya stood behind her mother, filming everything on her phone, and I remember thinking how surreal it was that even in this moment of confrontation, the instinct to document it for content was still there. Then the situation escalated beyond anything I could have anticipated. Maya's mother got back in her car, and suddenly both vehicles were moving, engines roaring, headlights blinding me as they started driving aggressively, circling my car, boxing me in. I tried to reverse, to get away, but they were coordinated, working together to trap me on that dark road. Maya was driving one of the cars now, her mother in the passenger seat shouting instructions, and the influencer I had followed online for makeup tips and fashion advice was actively participating in what I was beginning to realize was an attempt to hurt me. I managed to break free, my car scraping against theirs as I forced my way out of the trap they had created, and I floored the accelerator, racing down that dark road with both of their vehicles chasing me. The speedometer climbed past 80, past 90, my hand shaking on the steering wheel as I tried to navigate turns and keep distance between us. I called emergency services, screaming into my phone that I was being chased, that someone was trying to run me off the road, giving the operator my location and begging them to send help. But they did not stop. They kept chasing, kept trying to force me off the road, and on one particularly sharp turn, I lost control. My car spun, hit the guardrail, and for a moment everything went silent, except for the sound of metal scraping and glass shattering. I was conscious but dazed, my airbag deployed and my chest aching from the impact. And through my cracked windshield I could see their cars pulling up alongside mine. Maya and her mother got out, and instead of checking if I was alive or calling for help, they stood there filming, recording my destroyed car and my bloodied face like it was content for their personal archive. That is when I heard the sirens. Police had been tracking my emergency call and arrived just as Maya and her mother were deciding what to do next. I watched through my broken window as officers surrounded them, ordered them to the ground, took their phones as evidence. Maya's perfect influencer composure cracked then, tears streaming down her face as she was handcuffed, her mother still screaming about betrayal and revenge, even as she was being arrested. I spent that night in the hospital with a concussion, broken ribs, and lacerations that required stitches. But I was alive, which is more than I can say for the two people who were in the other car, the one that got caught in the chase and crashed when Maya tried to ram my vehicle. They died on impact, innocent victims who were just driving on the same road at the wrong time, whose lives ended because a TikTok influencer and her mother decided that revenge was worth killing for. The trial was a media circus. Maya's TikTok following meant the case got national attention, true crime podcasts and YouTube documentaries dissecting every detail, analyzing the footage she had filmed that night as evidence of premeditation. Her videos were played in court, showing her glamorous lifestyle contrasted against the violent reality of what she had participated in. People who had followed her for years struggled to reconcile the smiling makeup tutorial girl with the person who had chased someone down a dark road and contributed to 2 deaths. She was convicted of murder, her mother too, both sentenced to life in prison. The judge noted that Maya had every opportunity to stop what was happening, that instead of de-escalating or calling for help, she had actively participated, had filmed the violence, had treated the entire situation like content to be documented rather than a crime to be prevented. Her TikTok account was deleted, her videos scrubbed from the platform, but screenshots and re-uploads circulated for months afterward, people morbidly fascinated by the influencer who became a killer. I testified at the trial, recounted every detail of that night, described the terror of being chased and the surreal horror of watching someone I had followed online try to murder me. Maya looked at me from across the courtroom with the same blank expression she used in her videos, like she was performing for an audience that was no longer there, still unable to process that her actions had real consequences beyond likes and comments and follower counts. The documentary about the case aired a year later, exploring how social media culture creates personas that hide darkness beneath polished surfaces, how the pressure to maintain a perfect online image can drive people to desperate measures when that image is threatened. I did not watch it. I could not sit through another retelling of the worst night of my life. Another analysis of Maya's psychology and social media presence and the factors that led to murder. The people who made that documentary probably thought they were providing important commentary on influencer culture, but to me it felt like exploitation, like turning tragedy into entertainment under the guise of education. I do not use TikTok anymore. I cannot scroll through videos of perfect lives and curated moments without wondering what darkness exists behind those smiles, what violence might lurk beneath those polished exteriors. Maya taught me that the person you see online is never the complete truth, that followers and verification checkmarks and viral videos mean nothing when it comes to actual character. She had hundreds of thousands of people who thought they knew her, who trusted her recommendations and admired her lifestyle, and none of them suspected she was capable of participating in murder. Sometimes I see her old videos re-uploaded by true crime channels, clips of her doing makeup or showing outfit hauls, edited together with ominous music and text overlays explaining what she would later be convicted of. The comments are always the same. People expressing shock that someone who seemed so normal could do something so terrible, analyzing her expressions for signs of psychopathy, debating whether social media fame corrupted her or whether she was always capable of violence and just hid it well. I know the answer to that question, even if they do not. Maya was always capable of what she did. The TikTok persona was not hiding a monster. It was the monster. The narcissism and need for control, an inability to handle anything that threatened her carefully constructed image. When her mother's relationship fell apart, it became a threat to their family's reputation, to the perfect life they were selling online, and rather than accept imperfection, they chose violence. I survived that night, but I carry the scars physically and mentally. I survived because police arrived in time, because I got lucky when my car hit the guardrail instead of flipping completely, because Maya and her mother hesitated just long enough for help to arrive. 2 other people were not as fortunate. They died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because an influencer and her mother were too consumed by rage and ego to care about collateral damage. If you follow influencers on social media, I want you to remember something. You do not know these people. You know the version of themselves they choose to show you, the edited and filtered and carefully curated performance they put on for an audience. Behind that performance could be kindness and authenticity, or behind it could be someone capable of violence, someone who values their image more than human life. Someone who will do terrible things to protect the illusion of perfection. Maya taught me that lesson in the worst possible way. I hope you never have to learn it the way I did.
My name is Daniel. I'm 24 and building animal suits is my hobby. I don't do it for brands or stores, and I'm not mocking any religion. I sew the fur myself, shape the foam, install small fans inside the head so I can breathe, and then I wear it to conventions where people like me gather without being judged. That year, the event was scheduled right before Easter weekend, which meant the city was full of decorations and people shopping for candy. My rabbit design is not an Easter mascot, but I understood that not everyone would see the difference. Even so, I felt safe near the convention center because I was surrounded by others in costume. On Saturday afternoon, I stepped outside with the head on to take a few photos near the entrance. I had no idea that someone across the street was already watching me with the kind of focus that doesn't fade once it starts. The man stood near a bus stop, staring at me without blinking or smiling, and the way he looked at the suit felt less like confusion and more like accusation. He crossed the street slowly, holding a folded pamphlet in one hand, and stopped a few feet away from me.
This is offensive.
And you know it. I lifted the rabbit head halfway so he could see my face and hear me clearly. I'm not dressed as the Easter Bunny. This is just my hobby, and I mean no disrespect. He began speaking louder, talking about how Easter was sacred and how people had turned it into a shopping event filled with fake symbols. He said rabbits were part of the problem and that people like me were mocking something holy. His tone wasn't curious or calm. It was angry and tight, and he didn't pause to listen. I apologized again, even though I didn't believe I'd done anything wrong, because I wanted the situation to end without escalation. Instead, he stepped closer and said that apologies didn't erase public insults. People nearby stared but didn't interfere, and I eventually walked back inside the convention center. For the next few hours, I convinced myself it was over, even though his expression stayed in my head longer than I expected. When the convention closed, I decided to keep going as I walked toward the parking lot, because changing inside would take longer, and I only had to walk a short distance. As I walked toward the parking lot, I heard footsteps behind me that matched my rhythm too closely to ignore. When I turned my head slightly, I saw him again, walking fast and holding a wooden stick at his side. My breathing grew louder inside the rabbit head, and the small fans hummed in my ears while I increased my pace. The oversized feet made quick movement awkward, but I tried to stay steady. He adjusted his pace as well, closing the distance without hesitation. "You think you can just walk away from this?" His voice carried across the quiet street, and it was clear he had followed me on purpose. I started moving faster toward the parking lot entrance, which was poorly lit and mostly empty at that hour. The sound of the stick hitting the pavement behind me made it clear he was not there to talk anymore. I realized that I was alone in a space where no one would immediately intervene. I tried to move faster, but the suit limited my stride and made every step heavier. The first hit landed on my upper back and forced me forward onto my hands and knees. The internal frame of the costume absorbed some of the impact, but the pain still shot through my ribs and made my breathing harder. Before I could stand, he grabbed one of the long rabbit ears and pulled my head backward. "This is what happens when you mock what is sacred." I tried to speak, telling him that this was not about Easter, but he struck my side with the stick, and the words broke apart into a strained gasp. He dropped the stick and used both of his hands to rip at the suit, tearing the shoulder seam so the white fur split open and foam spilled out. He twisted the rabbit head violently until I heard the plastic crack inside, and then he yanked it off completely, exposing my face. He looked at me with disgust and punched me across the cheek, snapping my head sideways and leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. "You hide behind this and pretend it is harmless." He shoved me down and pressed his knee against my chest while leaning close enough that I could see the tension in his jaw. I pushed against him, but he was stronger and driven by a belief that made him relentless. He grabbed my collar and dragged me across the pavement, scraping my back and continuing to speak about sin, correction, and punishment. He stepped back for a second, picked up the stick again and raised it as if deciding how to finish what he had started. I knew that if I didn't act, the next strike would land on my face. When he swung downward, I lifted my arm to block it and felt the impact slam into my forearm with enough force to make me cry out. The stick slipped from his hand, and I kicked forward with both legs to push him off balance. I tried to stand, but one torn rabbit foot caught under me and I stumbled. He grabbed my ankle and pulled me back down, ripping the remaining fabric so my real shoe showed through. "You twist faith into a costume and expect nothing to happen." He kicked my side again, and the pain forced air out of my lungs. I managed to grab the fallen stick before he did and swung it towards his knee, hitting hard enough to make him stagger. He did not fall, but the movement gave me a few seconds to crawl toward the brighter area near the entrance. At that moment, I saw two attendees running from the convention doors, drawn by the noise. I shouted for help, and my voice cracked but carried across the lot. He turned toward them, frustrated rather than afraid. He rushed at me once more and punched my stomach twice, folding me forward while repeating that he was teaching me a lesson I would remember every Easter. Before he could strike again, One of the attendees tackled him from the side and both of them hit the ground hard. Another person kicked the stick away, and together they pinned his arms down while he continued shouting about saving souls and stopping corruption. Police arrived within minutes because someone had called during the struggle. The officers pulled him off the ground and forced his hands behind his back. Even as they secured him, he twisted his head to look at me directly.
"This is not over. You will think about this next year."
His tone was calm in a way that made the threat feel planned rather than emotional. An officer later told me he had a similar history of confrontations during religious holidays, including previous assaults tied to what he considered blasphemy. Hearing that made it clear I'd not been randomly chosen, but targeted because of timing and costume. Paramedics checked my arm, ribs, and face, confirming that nothing was broken even though the bruises were deep and spreading. My suit lay destroyed nearby, white fur torn open and foam scattered across the asphalt. The physical pain faded after a few weeks, but the memory of his expression stayed sharp. I rebuilt the suit with stronger internal supports and thicker straps, because I no longer trusted public spaces to be neutral. I still attend conventions, but I never leave alone, and I always scan the street before stepping outside. On Easter Sunday 2022 in France, an armed man attacked several people in the street for religious reasons. The incident sparked debate about the increase in violence and social tensions during religious holidays in France. I moved into a small wooden house outside Yekaterinburg because it was cheap and far from everything. The road in front was dirt, and after sunset, no cars passed. There were no neighbors close enough to see my windows clearly. I had arrived in Russia alone, and I had no one nearby to call if something went wrong. The house had a front porch and 2 large windows facing the road. At night, the only light came from a weak pole near the trees. I kept the curtains half open because I didn't want to feel trapped inside. That decision changed quickly. One night I saw a man standing near the trees across the road. He wasn't walking or smoking or using a phone. He was just standing there, facing my house. His posture looked all wrong, like his body was stiff in places that should move easily. I stayed at the window longer than I should have. He didn't wave or leave, he just stayed still until I stepped away. The next night he came back at the same hour. This time he stood closer to the road. He didn't hide. He wanted to be seen. His shoulders were uneven, and his head leaned slightly to one side. On the 3rd night, he opened my yard gate and stepped inside. He moved slowly, dragging one leg. I could see his clothes clearly now. They were torn and hung loosely from his body. When he lifted his face toward the house, I saw his mouth stretched wide. Thin metal needles pierced both corners of his lips, pulling them back into a forced grin. It was not a normal injury. It looked deliberate. I called the police the next morning. They asked if he broke anything. I said no. They told me to lock my doors and stop worrying. On the 4th night, I turned off every light and waited in the dark. I held a wooden fireplace poker in both hands. I knew he would enter the yard again, because he'd been moving closer every night. He stepped through the gate and crossed the yard slowly. Each step looked painful. His breathing carried through the quiet air. It sounded strained, like his chest was damaged. He reached the porch and placed his hand on the door. The handle moved slowly. The wood creaked under pressure. He didn't slam it. He pushed with steady force. The door cracked near the lock and gave way. I shoved the table against it, but the legs scraped across the floor as he kept pushing. The door opened enough for him to step inside. He entered without rushing. From only a few feet away, I saw stitches across his cheeks and neck. Dried blood marked the edges of his mouth where the needles held his lips open. His eyes looked red and unfocused. I swung the poker at his shoulder with both hands. The impact made him sway, but he did not fall. He didn't attack. He adjusted his balance and stepped forward again. I struck his arm next. His elbow bent strangely, but he barely reacted. He let out a low breath and kept moving. His body trembled with effort. He was not moving slowly to scare me. He was barely able to stand. He stopped a few feet away from me in the kitchen. His breathing was loud and uneven. Blood began to form fresh lines near the needles in his mouth. The forced grin did not change. I kept the poker raised, but I hesitated. His eyes didn't look violent. They looked confused and exhausted. He leaned slightly against the counter as if he needed support. Before I could decide what to do, the front door was kicked fully open. Heavy boots rushed into the house. Several men dressed in black tactical clothing entered within seconds. Two of them grabbed the injured man without speaking. Another seized my arm and forced me against the wall. One man leaned in close to my face. "Leave." His tone was controlled, but angry. I tried to speak, but another man struck me hard on the side of the head. I woke up on the living room floor with sharp pain in my skull. The house was quiet. The broken door had been temporarily secured from the inside. 2 suitcases stood near the hallway. They were packed with my clothes and documents. My passport rested on top. I had not packed anything. I called the police again. They claimed there was no report on file and no patrol had been sent to my address. Their voices sounded uninterested. I left Russia within a week. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I said the job wasn't working out. I searched online for information about illegal experiments, but I stopped quickly. The stories I found felt incomplete and dangerous to dig into. What I saw was not a creature. It was a human body, damaged on purpose. The needles in his mouth were not decoration. They were control. I don't look for answers anymore. I live quietly and avoid talking about that house. Some nights I still wake up expecting to see someone standing near the trees, waiting to move closer again. My name is Henry, and since my wife passed away, I spend too many nights awake without anything to do. My daughter, Sophia, is now a teenager and spends all her time in her room or with her friends. So when the house gets quiet, I fall into the same routine. I know it's not right, but it was my guilty pleasure. It became part of my life before I even noticed. I didn't expect it to turn into something dangerous. It all began when I found a dark web page some months ago. It had no design, just a list of links with strange codes. When I clicked one, it showed a live feed of a grocery store. Another was a parking lot. Another was someone's kitchen. All private cameras that should not be online. I kept returning because it was the only thing that distracted me when the nights got long. I didn't do it because I felt it was important. I did it because I felt nothing. One night started just like the others. I turned on the computer, put on the headphones, and opened the same page I always checked. I thought it would be another quiet night of watching people who didn't know I existed. I had no idea I was about to see something that would break every sense of safety I had left. The site had a new section called Street Index. It looked like a random collection of neighborhoods, each with feeds from different angles. I clicked through a few out of simple curiosity. Most of them were empty sidewalks and parked cars. Then, one of the streets stopped me cold. I didn't move for a few seconds because I recognized the layout. The same slope, the same fence at the corner. It was my street. I clicked the next link under that address. It switched to a view from across the road, pointing directly at my house. I stared at the front door on the screen and then looked at it in real life. The angle was identical to someone standing on the sidewalk and recording without being seen. I checked my window to make sure no one was out there, but it was too dark to see anything. There was another link under the same section. Hallway Night. I hovered over it for a moment because something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't ignore. I clicked anyway. The feed opened after 1 second of static, and I felt panic. I was looking at the upstairs hallway inside my own home. The camera pointed towards Sophie's room. The timestamp was live. My hands started shaking in a way I couldn't hide from myself. I sat in that chair trying to understand how someone could record the inside of my house without me noticing. I didn't have any cameras there. Nothing made sense, and the fear didn't give me time to think straight. Everything felt too real. I walked upstairs slowly because I didn't know if someone was inside the house. Every sound made me stop for a second. When I reached the hallway, everything looked normal. Sophie's door was closed. The carpet was untouched. I checked the walls, the lamps, the corners near the ceiling. I didn't find any device. I wanted to believe the video was old, but the timestamp on the screen didn't stop. The next morning, I tried to make it sound like a normal conversation with Sophie, even though my voice kept shaking in ways I couldn't control. "Did you leave your phone camera on at night?" "No." "Then stop using the phone so late. Just put it away." "Why are you acting weird?" I didn't know how to answer without scaring her, so I ended the talk before she pushed more. The moment she left for school, I tore apart every device we owned. I smashed the laptops. I broke the tablets. I took apart the old phones we kept in a drawer. The fear felt like a weight I couldn't get off my chest. I didn't want any camera inside my home again. That night I tried to sleep, but my nerves kept waking me up every few minutes. I felt watched, even with the lights off and the electronics destroyed. I couldn't shut off the idea that the feed might still be active somewhere. Around 2 a.m., my phone vibrated. It was a text message from a private number. It had a link and 1 sentence telling me to open it. I stared at the screen for almost a full minute because I didn't want to touch it. My hands were sweating and my breathing got fast again. But fear has a way of pushing you toward things you don't want to face. I clicked. A page opened with my daughter's full name at the top, her school, her favorite food, her online accounts, places she visited often. There were folders filled with information that no one should have access to. At the bottom was one folder marked Home Alone Files. I pressed it, even though my whole body was tense. There were many videos inside, all recent, all taken without her knowing. One showed her brushing her hair after school. Another had her laughing on the phone. When I thought things couldn't get any worse, I saw it. It was a folder titled Bed View. I froze, terrified of what I was going to find. I opened the folder. There were hundreds of videos of Sophie sleeping, taken from inside the room, and there was another one with the camera placed close to her face. I paused it because I felt dizzy, like my chest was closing in. A new text appeared. "You watched people. Now it's your turn." My vision blurred for a moment. I wiped my eyes and kept staring at the message. Nothing about this felt like something I could control anymore. I stayed awake until morning because I couldn't risk closing my eyes. The next day, I searched her room again. I moved every piece of furniture. I checked every vent. I ran my hands across the walls looking for holes or lenses. I didn't care if I destroyed everything. Sophie stood in the doorway asking what I was doing, and I couldn't give her a real answer. I kept pulling things apart because the fear had already taken over every thought I had. Then, my phone vibrated again. "Stop searching." I felt nauseous as more texts appeared, one after another. "We told you to stop."
You broke your devices. We added ours. You wanted to watch. Now watch yourself lose control. I dropped the phone. Every corner of the house felt unsafe. I kept waiting for another message. Look outside. I didn't want to go near the window. I took a few slow steps because I felt like someone was watching from the dark. When I finally looked, a car was parked across the street, with its lights off. A small blinking light flashed inside, slow and steady like a device recording. Another message came. Last warning. You took from others. Now we take from you. This does not end. The car engine started. The taillights turned red. It drove away slowly, as if whoever was inside wasn't worried about being followed. I didn't move from the window for a long time. I couldn't decide if I should keep watching or hide. The messages stopped, but the damage was already done. Weeks have passed and the fear hasn't faded. I haven't slept a full night. Every small sound makes me walk through the hallway to check on Sophie. I keep the windows locked and the curtains closed. I don't touch anything with a camera. I don't want to see anything. I don't want anyone to see us. Sometimes late at night, I think I see a blinking light far down the street. I don't know if it's real or if I'm too scared to trust what I see. But I know one thing with certainty. Someone out there has videos of my home, my daughter, our private life. Someone watched us while we slept. Someone felt entitled to do it because I watched strangers first.
My name is Leonard, and I was the only physician on duty that night at Black Ridge Hospital. The shift had been quiet and mechanical, with routine cases and long empty stretches between them. I preferred that kind of rhythm because it kept everything controlled and predictable. I was reviewing charts near the nurses' station when I noticed someone sitting alone in the waiting area. She was positioned against the far wall, sitting upright with her hands flat on her knees. Her back was straight and her chin slightly lowered, but her eyes were open and fixed forward. She did not blink, and she did not adjust her posture. No one had checked her in, and no one seemed to know when she had arrived. I walked toward her and introduced myself in a calm tone. I asked her name and whether she needed help. She did not react in any way, and her breathing was slow but steady. Her expression was empty but not confused, and that difference made my stomach tighten. I signaled security to confirm whether anyone had entered recently. They reported no movement at the doors. I called the local police to report a silent woman possibly in distress. I turned for a second to grab a blanket. When I faced her chair again, she was gone. I searched the waiting room and nearby bathrooms immediately. The doors had not opened, and security insisted no one had passed them. There was no sound of footsteps and no sign of hurried movement. The chair where she had been sitting was perfectly aligned. I moved down the main corridor toward the older wing because it was the only direction she could have gone. The lights were steady and the floor was empty. My pace slowed as I scanned each doorway. I felt exposed walking alone in that long hallway. Halfway down, I saw her standing at the far end near the radiology turn. She was upright and motionless, arms hanging straight at her sides. Her eyes were locked directly onto mine. The distance between us felt tight, even though it was several meters. I called out to her and asked if she was lost. She did not answer and did not blink. I took a cautious step forward. Her head adjusted slightly to maintain eye contact. That small movement made my chest tighten. Before anything happened, there was a pause that felt deliberate. The hallway was silent except for the hum of overhead lights. I could hear my own breathing and the faint buzz of electricity. She remained still for 1 second longer. Then she ran. Her steps were fast and heavy, striking the tile in sharp rhythm. Her arms stayed stiff while her body leaned forward. There was no scream and no hesitation. She closed the distance quickly, I turned and ran without thinking. I pushed through the double doors near radiology and nearly lost my footing. I heard the doors slam behind me. Her footsteps followed without slowing. I cut into a supply room and pulled the door almost shut. I stood against the shelves and tried to steady my breathing. The hallway outside went quiet. The silence felt wrong. When I opened the door to look, she was standing directly in front of it. Before she touched me, I understood that she was about to. I tried to push past her into the corridor. She shifted instantly and blocked me. She slammed me against the wall with force. My back hit hard and air left my lungs. Her hand clamped onto my jaw and held my face in place. I grabbed her wrist and pulled with both hands. Her grip tightened instead of loosening. I felt my cheeks being forced upward. My mouth stretched unnaturally and pain shot through my face. She leaned close enough that I could see every detail of her skin. Her expression did not change. There was no emotion and no strain. She pressed harder, and I felt my jaw shift under pressure. I drove my knee into her abdomen. She stumbled back and hit the floor. I kicked her leg and she collapsed against a cart. The cart rattled loudly. She stood up again without changing her expression. Before she could reach me again, I pushed off the wall and ran. My jaw throbbed and I could taste blood. I did not look back because I could hear her steps for a second behind me. I turned the corner toward the nurse's station and nearly crashed into security. Lionel grabbed my shoulders and stared at my face. He asked what had happened while I struggled to speak clearly. We checked the camera footage from the hallway. The recording showed me running alone. It showed me slamming myself against the wall and fighting empty air. There was no woman visible near me. My face twisted on camera as if invisible hands were pulling it. The footage showed me kicking at nothing. Lionel replayed it twice. There was still no sign of her. Police searched the building and found nothing. No entry logs and no witnesses. My jaw was partially dislocated and finger-shaped bruises formed on my cheeks. No one could explain them. I finished the shift sitting in a chair with ice pressed against my face. The pain was sharp and constant. Every movement of my mouth reminded me of her grip. No one else in the hospital reported seeing her that night. No one matching her description appeared on any camera. The official report listed it as an unexplained injury. I kept working there because I needed the job. I avoided the older corridor whenever possible. I never saw her again in the building. Sometimes during late shifts, I glance at the waiting room wall where she first sat. I imagine her upright posture and those open eyes. I'm afraid.